Hello readers, I'm Amy. Yes, my hair is pink now. Also, I'm going through a Scream phase because I just watched the new movie. It was alright. It could have been better in some ways, but was really good in others, so it's solid. But yes, I have never dyed my entire head before, but I think I like it. Everyone else seems to think that I'm rocking it, so anyways. Today's video, I am actually going to be recommending some books to my high school self. So if this is something that interests you, I think you should make your own video, because the more I thought about this idea, the more just fun it seemed. Like I would love to have been there for my high school self and guided my high school self through life to make more discoveries. Like, I had so many major discoveries about myself in college that it almost would have been nice to know when I was younger, so I don't know. Yeah, let's get started on some recommendations. There's gonna be some different kind of categories here. So some of these recommendations for my high school self will be based on my reading tastes at that time, and others will be based on things that I think I should have known or should have learned about and didn't get the chance to. For the record, I did grow up in a very small town in the center of Montana. The population has been at 5,000 or 6,000 since the 90s, and I know that because I checked the population on Google once out of curiosity. There was like a big spike, I think in 2006. By 600 people, and then it went back down. So yeah, small town, very white, very religious, really very like Baptist. I don't think there's any Catholic churches in my hometown that I know of. So that's just kind of a little bit of my background and where I'm coming from. I've come a long way since then. Yeah, so let's get started on some of those recommendations. I'm going to do some of my fun ones first. So, I tried to read Stepford Wives in high school, I believe, and it wasn't the most interesting to me at that time. It wasn't a writing style that I'd really gotten into at that age. I wasn't into like the 70s style of writing and classics until college. So luckily I did attempt Stepford Wives later on in life and really enjoyed it. But I think based on my interest in Stepford Wives, even though I wasn't really able to get into it at the time, I would recommend The Husbands by Chandler Baker. I think I do actually have, I know I have a standalone review for Stepford Wives. I believe I also have a standalone review for The Husbands, so you can actually check out both of those on my channel. But The Husbands is the kind of reverse look at Stepford Wives. So in Stepford Wives, you have a family move to a small town, and the women are all very weird, very robotic, very much about making the best lives for their husbands, and not really having any concern for their own best interests. And in The Husbands, it's the opposite, where you have a family move to a town, and all of the women are these really high-powered people, and the husbands stay at home. And I think this would have been much more in line with my reading tastes at the time, and it also would have given me a little bit of that introduction to feminism. Now, if you've watched my video on The Husbands, I do have some mixed feelings about the feminism of this book, like in a good way. Like, it really makes you think. And I don't know how much I would have understood those nuances at that age, but I think that this would have given me the introduction to feminism that I think I was really searching for at that age. So I think this would be a good one. Then we have I'll Give You the Sun. This is just like the perfect teen book. I don't actually remember a lot of the details about it because it's been a couple years since I've read it, but it's about twins. I believe it has queer characters in it. It's very emotional. It's beautifully written. I ate this up as an adult, and I think I would have eaten this up as a teen. It's just one of those books that is an excellent, engrossing read across all ages, and I think it would have given me a little bit of a spark. It would have given me another book to fall in love with as a kid. Now, as most of us were, I was also into fantasy as a child, and not so much now. I found that my area of interest in fantasy tends to be standalone fantasy, because in most cases, the way I phrase it is that I would rather read 10 books by 10 authors instead of 10 books by one author. Even with authors I really love, it's like I want to read as many different people as possible. But as far as fantasy and series, I think I'm going to recommend Dorothy Must Die, which I also have a video on this series. I haven't finished it yet. I finished the main series, but there are 3 or 4 novellas, or 3 or 4 collections of novellas, because I think there's 9 separate novellas that go along with this series that talk about Dorothy's past, whereas these focus on Dorothy's future and a new main character. But I really enjoyed these. I think I would have liked the Wizard of Oz base to this story. As much as I enjoyed it as an adult, I think I would have enjoyed it more in high school, because it is that young adult writing style that I was more into at the time. But regardless, I think I would have had a lot of fun with this. Next up on my list, also in the fantasy realm, because I did read quite a bit of fantasy growing up, I am gonna go with The Princess Bride. I did watch the movie growing up, and I love the book. Like, the movie's good, but I think I like the book better with this. And I believe I included the movie and the book in my ranking of book to movie adaptations. Like, the movie's really good, but if you haven't read the book and you enjoyed the movie, I think you should try and read the book. I really love William Goldman's use of parentheses. Almost every single paragraph, and definitely every single chapter in this book has at least one set of parentheses. Like, there will be run-on sentences and whole paragraphs that are just in a parentheses. And it's just a really humorous way of writing. I think I would have had a good time with this, and it also would have let me know that not all fantasies have to be series. You can build a great world just with one book, which isn't something I was really aware of growing up. Then we will go on to, let's do like lifestyle, I think is what I would call this next section. So the first book that I'm going to talk about as far as kind of lifestyles and introducing different lifestyles to myself as a high schooler, I would do Selfish, Shallow, and Self-Absorbed, 16 Writers on the Decision Not to Have Kids. This is one of my favorite nonfictions of all time. Collection of essays, which isn't usually something that makes a very popular book. I feel like essay collections, you like some, you don't like all of them. They're usually not at the top of people's favorites lists, but I loved this one. I loved how it was written. I loved the discussions in here, and I think this would have been an excellent way to introduce alternative lifestyles to myself. Growing up in a small town, it's very traditional. It's white, it's religious. You grow up, you get married, you have babies, that sort of thing, and there just weren't a lot of examples of those alternatives for me, and I think that this would have really helped open my mind at the time and show me different ways of life. Also, I am adopted. I've talked about that on this channel a couple times, and I always kind of had this idea growing up, like maybe I would have kids of my own, but I would probably adopt. Like, that always sounded like a good idea. I could take in a kid that didn't have a home. Just like I was adopted as a kid, or as a baby. But adoption always seemed like the way I would go if I decided to have kids. And now I've decided I'm just not having kids, which is also fine. But that wasn't really a decision I made until later, and not having kids wasn't really an option that was talked about at all. So I didn't have a bad view of not having kids, but I didn't really have any idea of not having kids, good or bad. Next up, we have Fuzz by Mary Roach. Mary Roach is one of my favorite nonfiction authors. Her humor isn't everyone's style, but it is my style, and she has a lot of her humor in not only her writing, but in the footnotes in this nonfiction. And Fuzz is one that I just think I would have had fun with. I grew up in the country. I was about a 20-minute drive from town in good weather, probably 30 minutes if it was really, really snowy. And Fuzz is about the law and animals. So I would have been, I think, really interested in a book like this, growing up in Montana, growing up around a lot of wild animals. I went through hunter's safety, so I learned some of the laws around that. And I think that this just would have been really fun for me to learn about wild animals in my own vicinity, wild animals around the world, and the laws surrounding them. And I think I would have found it hilarious. And really, any opportunity to get someone interested in nonfiction is an opportunity that you should take. Then I have one more kind of lifestyle recommendation. I don't want to talk about this too much because I already have a video on it, and it can still be a pretty emotional topic for me. But Judy Blume's Deanie. We've all heard of Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. It's her very famous book about becoming a teen and starting your period, that sort of thing. But Deanie is about a girl who has scoliosis and needs to learn about scoliosis and wear a back brace, and there's some really emotional scenes in it, particularly for me because, as I state in the video that I made on this book, I have scoliosis. I had multiple surgeries as a child to take care of that. It was one of the hardest things that I've ever gone through in my life, and I get pretty emotional in that video. So light trigger warning for a super emotional person. But as hard of a time as that was, I think that this book would have been good for me to have someone to connect to. It is young adult, so it's emotional without being too heavy. And I didn't know anyone like me. I was that kid. I had the back brace, I had the glasses, and I had the braces. I think all at the same time. Like, I was not attractive as a kid. But I didn't really have anyone to talk to about that stuff. Of course I could talk to my friends, but they weren't really gonna understand what I was going through, and this would have made me feel a little less alone in the world. Then we're gonna get into some culture books. All of these books, the reasoning behind them is mostly going to be I need to expand my view on the world, or I would have wanted to expand my high school aged view on the world. First one is The Legend of Skeleton Man. So I was sent this copy of this book by my friend Hillary from Melted Books. This is actually both Skeleton Man books. I only ever knew of one. But it wasn't, like, I thought it looked really interesting. It looked really cool. And it wasn't until I started reading it that I realized I read this as a kid. I read the first book in elementary school, and it was really creepy, but it was really good. I wouldn't have gotten into horror until much later. But even having read this as a kid, the reason I want to include this on this list of books that I would recommend to my high school self or to my elementary school self is I did read this book as a kid, but I read it alone. I don't think anyone else that I was talking to had really heard of it. No one else had really read it. I didn't have people to talk about it with. And it wasn't until I was an adult and rereading this book and looking into the author. The author is actually Native American. And when you read the book, there's a real pattern of like talking about trauma with kids and passing on stories and where our stories come from. And I think that I would recommend this to my high school or elementary school self as a school book, which also brings us into the discussion of school book bans and that whole shit show. Don't even get me started. But this book would have been excellent as a book to read together as a class. Like, we all have to read To Kill a Mockingbird. We all have to read Romeo and Juliet, whatever. This would have been an excellent opportunity to discuss the history behind stories and books and why they're written and how they're written. We could have talked about childhood traumas and how to talk about adults when you're going through things, and it would have been an excellent opportunity to talk at least a little bit about Native American history and how that brought this author to writing this book. So I already read it as a kid, but I would recommend this to myself as a kid, just read differently, because I think I didn't have the understanding of the world or the understanding of the intricacies of books and writing to really get and understand the Skeleton Man as a kid, so I think reading it as a class would have really gone a long way for me. Then we have Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot. This really focuses on Black women and women of color. We're talking about poor people and the lives that they're living and how they got to be there, and food stamps and work, and just it encompasses so many different layers of topics. And while I don't think I would have understood everything as a kid, I don't even know how well I would have vibed with the writing style as a kid. I think that it would have been excellent, again, maybe as a school book for everyone to read, because growing up in the place that I grew up, I didn't learn about Black people and people of color and Native Americans and the real history there. Just, you had slavery, and then you had the 70s, kind of. Like, we didn't have those conversations growing up, and this would have been an excellent opportunity to have those conversations, to teach those things, and I would have had a much more realistic idea of the world. I went into college just with these happy-go-lucky ideas like, oh, we're all equal and I don't see color and the world is rainbows and butterflies, and it's not. The world is complicated. I had no idea how complicated, and I would have loved to have been introduced to some of that complexity at an earlier age. Same reason that I'm going to recommend The Best We Could Do. This one I would have gotten on a lot better with. I didn't really read graphic novels as a kid. It's not something that a lot of people really had access to. They're very expensive books. Graphic novels can take up a lot of space. It's just not something we had a lot of. But The Best We Could Do is talking about, I want to say, a Vietnamese family and intergenerational traumas, or not intergenerational, generational traumas, immigration. I didn't know anything about immigration. I'm from Montana. Should have learned more about that. Also, this story is just heart-wrenching and beautiful, and the artwork is gorgeous. I drew a lot more as a kid, so this kind of stuff would have appealed to me there as well, and it has an excellent color story. Same thing with The Magic Fish. This one, I believe, is also... Is it Vietnamese? It's Vietnamese. Beautiful color story. You've got different colors for different, like, perspectives. And this little boy is trying to figure out how to tell his immigrant mother that he's gay. Again, would have introduced me to alternative lifestyles, would have introduced me to alternative histories. I didn't learn anything about Vietnam as a kid. There was a Vietnam War and none of us really understood what it was about. That's it. That is my childhood knowledge of Vietnam. Basically anything I learned about another country was they had a war. Or if I learned about Italy and England, I learned about 1600s and earlier. Like, no modern history of other countries. This would have been great for that. It's a graphic novel. It's an easy read. It's emotional. It's beautiful. Should have learned about it. And lastly, again, alternative lifestyles recommendation. Find Layla by Meg Ellison. This is Meg Ellison's first young adult book, and this is about a girl who is taking care of her brother in her mom's house, and her mom is a hoarder, and at school she gets this science assignment, and she decides to do her science class project around the different things that grow in her house, which of course leads to some concerns, but it was so excellently written. I've never read a fiction about hoarders that I can remember. It's not a topic that's really discussed that much, and this is from a child's perspective, which makes it even more emotional. And you all know, if you've been here for 2 seconds, I love Meg Ellison. I love everything that she's written. Number One Fan was probably my least favorite, but that's just because it was really heavy for me. But regardless, you can't really go wrong with any of her books. And I love that she also had this young adult book that is going to be super relatable to kids who don't have their stories told. So, those are my recommendations for my high school self. Down in the comments, please let me know what you would recommend to your high school self, because I want to know, like, who were you as a kid? Who would you want yourself to be as a kid? What kind of stuff were you not taught that you wanted to learn? Quick book shot maybe for the thumbnail. These are all the books that I would recommend to my high school and elementary school self, I suppose. Please like, subscribe, be my friend on social media. I will see all of you in my next video. Bye, friends. I'm good.